Hello, in this video I want to start up the last part of the series that I'll be doing, starting to talk about Derrida. This has been really interesting because I really like doing this set of videos overall, and I really like talking about the ways in which I think Derrida will be really important for the upcoming water resolution. And so for this video, I kind of want to finish off the series by just talking a little bit about how I think Derrida works in the context of how people should be answering Derrida when it's presented to them on the affirmative, or how neg teams should be answering Derrida when it's like presented as an affirmative. Because I think in the last couple of videos, I definitely talked a little bit about how I think the best affirmatives for Derrida kind of will be end up being developed in the water resolution, and I definitely think that the question of like hauntology and the way that it relates to water resolution is a really, really important one. And so I think being able to talk about how you can answer these affirmatives, and like especially force apps that are really quoting from hauntology and aren't reading straight from Derrida to like really defend some stuff that maybe they aren't really keen to, I think can be really helpful, and also help you just develop how you can really like resolve this strategy depending on like whatever you want to read, whether it's a framework strategy, critical strategy, or a strategy based in like counterplans, disads, etc. I think there are a lot of really interesting ways that you can like deal with these types of affirmatives if you are kind of like taking into account some of the stuff that we've just been talking about through all the videos when we're pulling together different concepts from Derrida, and kind of using a lot of the key kind of like framing stuff that I've been talking about here in order to kind of frame a lot of the thoughts that I'll have for the rest of the video. I think that when you're just generally talking about how you should be resolving these affirmatives in terms of how you should be doing the case debate, I really think that you need to like do a lot of work trying to explain how you want to like resolve the question of like what does hauntology attempt to like accomplish, and like what does that mean in terms of how it's able to like create a political methodology that meets that kind of like telos, right? I think that spotting out early on how the team is kind of orienting and who they're kind of orienting hauntology towards is extremely important, because I think that a lot of times, especially teams that are really not thinking deeply about like the way in which like the presentation of like specters operates in debate, I think that they're only thinking about the process of like how we literally take ghosts with us everywhere, but often are not kind of like reading or making some evidence that is able to reading or kind of like putting out evidence or cutting it in a way that is meant to talk about the way in which like specters do intracommunal work, and not how they're meant to like convince people external to the community being affected. I think that although like this is like something that will require like a differential interpretation of like how Derrida is read in a relationship to like various marginalized communities, I also think that being able to like push the affirmative team into like having to defend a more hardline defensive Derrida that is about the ability of specters to convince politicians can be a really good place for you to start some of this like earlier on offensive portion of the debate, and what I think can generally be said as like a large priority when you're trying to debate them. So like for instance, when you're trying to figure out how you should try to like push their solvency advocate, I think the more that you can get them to kind of like admit that the way in which they're using specters as an attempt to change like how political decision making is done as like a political process allows you to make so many arguments about why representation of ghosts of the dead don't actually do anything to change the decision making process, and also only allow the recognition of that kind of like specter without the ability to like take action in the name of that specter. And I think if your case debate really like harps on being able to separate like the action of like how people like move once they are kind of like informed of like this like representation, but also I think the way in which like the way in which on the inverse side how a lot of representation is kind of like formed via the like ability to only shine light on like those that are kind of like most acknowledged, those are kind of iconographed. I think there's a lot to be said about like the danger or the violence that accompanies those sources of representation, and not only how like they're inevitably incomplete, but like the presentation of them as complete when they are incomplete only like serves them in a sense to kind of like continue the farce that they are transformative via like their existence, and not like determining how we use them, which I think is like a much better way to like base a lot of the arguments you want to make. Because I think that in the last video where I kind of talked about how teams normally make arguments about like the affective register of hauntology, I'm not really sure that's like the most strategic route or like the most non-generic route to go down if you really want to contest these types of affirmatives. And I think it's much better to build a set of like case arguments that is about why representation as a whole and the idea of the representation of the dead doesn't actually allow for a creation of methodology unless there's kind of like these prior other factors that relate to the commitment of like the community, and that aren't based on like power structures like having a proper recognition of those specters as a whole. Because even if you like made examples of like the way in which like this state has tried to recognize like people like Harriet Tubman by like putting them on coins and stuff like that, I think there are really interesting ways that you can contest the idea that those kind of like sources of recognition actually mean something like politically meaningful. I think then when you kind of like switch maybe some of this advice onto how you're thinking about some of the stuff like the framework and T portions of the debate, I think that it's really important to consider how you kind of want to frame the framework and T portions of the debate in terms of like what debate's relationship to specters are. I think that you can both acknowledge the way in which framework has been used historically as like a tool of like policing and as a source of violence, while also simultaneously wanting that there's kind of like an importance to the way in which we frame debate as a space regardless, and making sense of like how like the idea that, for instance, even in a world where like ontology is a preferable method, the idea that like there shouldn't be even an unlimited like conversation over what the field of like what types of specters are relevant to the type of conversation that we're having makes it like impossible to have an evaluation of political methodology or like any in-depth conversations over like a year of debate, which I think is like a really interesting way for you to kind of like resolve maybe some of the considerations I made in the last couple of videos when talking about like how I think we can get back to the procedural portion of the debate. I think the easiest way to kind of deal with being locked out of like maybe the procedural portion is to recenter the debate by explaining that the kind of like crumbling of like this stasis portion of like how debate operates in relationship to the resolution makes it impossible for us to really focus in on the way in which particular types of specters haunt the resolution. And that particularity is important because proper like recognition and acknowledgement and accountability towards those specters requires us to like actively move towards like ways of being accountable that like dive really deeply into the history and acknowledge like all of the steps like along the way that kind of created the conditions that have like resulted in the current way in which we think about the organization of politics, which can only happen under the kind of like interpretation that you're offering. And then I think really kind of using like creative topical versions of the app that take into account like the process of ontology and the way that it changes like the types of political demands that are met could allow you to make really interesting ways of like making sense of how ontology could relate to the resolution. And I think serves as a point of like terminal defense that I think will gut check a lot of the things that a lot of these Derrida affirmers I think really get comfortable in terms of how they want to frame their like major beef with the state. And I think even if you can make arguments about how obviously the TVA doesn't lead to like the direct abolition or destruction of the state, that the idea that the TVA can't work at making the state feel like less complete, less whole, and like less determinate in its ability to like create and manage like populations, etc., and the way in which people are kind of like thinking about themselves like within cultural memory and like politically, I think can be a good way for you to talk about how ontology operates as like a way for destabilizing power, only when it allows us to like create and focus on like particular demands that are necessary for like longer term like political change and like the startup for that longer term political change. Hopefully this video was helpful for you, and hopefully you'll tune into the last video I'll be doing talking about the Derrida stuff. I've been really enjoying talking about this set of writing and a lot of the other stuff that I've just been able to do so far in general, so thanks for continually tuning in and watching.